I knew Ryan back when he had long hair and was 300 pounds. So now that I revolutionized your view of Ryan, let me revolutionize your view of the family. We're in Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. This passage has such power, and I pray, God, that I can convey to you just a small portion of this passage's power to transform our lives as families. Everyone in here is either a child or a parent. Some of us both. Grandparents, we know what this passage is talking about. And we all have different backgrounds. And I understand that some of us come from different backgrounds, which this passage challenges in certain ways. But I want to emphasize to you this morning that this is one of the few passages in the New Testament where God reveals to us what the family should be. I just want to look with you because this is revolutionary. As I suggest to you here, it transforms the family. And there are a few passages, the more you get into it, you realize, wait, this changes the way that I do family, whether it's a child, a parent, or a grandparent. So I want to look with you at three main ideas here, but just appreciate the fact that this passage focuses on the family as something which is focused upward to God and inward to our heart. That's very different than what the world thinks about the family being. And once we get that, it changes everything. It's transformative. I want to give you a sense of how transformative by reminding you of this man. Some of you know Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus. This 16th century astronomer changed the way that people thought about the world. If you know your history, you know that he was the one that told us that the solar system is made in such a way that the earth is not at the center. What's at the center? What's at the center? The sun. That's correct. Okay, I haven't lost complete faith in our school systems now. There's a heliocentric concept of the world. And so what he showed us is that rather than being on the left, the Ptolemaic view of the world as the earth at the center of the universe or the cosmos, the sun was. Can you imagine living in that day and having gone through that transition of paradigms to where now you thought about yourself not as the center but as orbiting the sun? That's a paradigm shift, isn't it? And what I want to suggest to you here this morning is that Ephesians chapter 6 is this sort of paradigm shift. When you see what Paul is revealing to us, you have this sort of Copernican revolution in our minds about what the family is. And so let's look at this morning because it is completely different once we see this transformation. You understand, though, that Ephesians chapter 6 is part of a larger book which is about transforming our minds, getting us to think differently about who we are. If you back up in Ephesians, you recognize that one thing that Paul has been emphasizing throughout this book is that we need to see things differently and that we need to understand how we have changed and start acting like it. And so my point here is this revolutionary idea about the family is nothing new in the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is revolutionizing people's view of who they are and how they should live in life. So not only are we no longer dead and separated, no longer do we not know what God is, and no longer are we simply children, and no longer are we like the Gentiles, but now we're alive, you see. Now we're brought near. Now we're ones that we have God revealed to us through the Scriptures. We're grown up, no longer infants, and we have learned Christ. Look at the contrast. This is like the Ptolemaic and the Copernican world. You see how things change. And Paul is moving through the book of Ephesians, and he's showing the difference, and he comes down to chapter 5 and 6, and he shows how that affects Christian lives. And so he talks about the family and how husbands and wives relate to us and how there's a submission there that changes everything both ways. And he talks about how we need to be imitators of God and imitators of Christ. And his point is that Christians, you need to have the care and the love of God in Christ. And when you read Ephesians with new eyes, you begin to say that he's showing us a new perspective. It's like he's giving you a new way of thinking about the world. Some of you have gone through surgeries. And you get out of the surgery and you're like, wow, this is completely different. Or you've gone through ceremonies and like, wow, this is completely different. I'm married. you go through those moments and you realize my perspective has shifted. My experience of this when I was 18 years old, I had not worn glasses before. It had gone too long. I went to the optometrist and got glasses and looked up at the moon and realized for the first time in my adult life, hey, there are craters on the moon. I had a new perspective. I wondered who this man in the moon everybody was talking about was, and then I knew all of a sudden. You have that new perspective. And so when we come to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, we see that there's a shift, a family paradigm shift. I call Ephesians 6 the family remix, because we no longer see the family, children and parents from the perspective of the world, but we see it from the perspective of God and the gospel. And it is completely different now as it was then. In the ancient world, fathers ruled with impunity. There was a thing in the ancient world called the patria potestas. This was a world in which the ancient man in his family, his Roman and his Greek family, and to a large extent the Jewish family, ruled with a rod of iron, literally sometimes. No one could question his power. Oftentimes he was viewed as a sort of master over his children, and ancient texts describe his children as slaves to him, whom he could even sell or kill at his will. We have ancient texts which describe fathers saying, I don't want that infant, lay it out and expose it. And that was within his right to do. He had the power because the family was about him, and to a lesser extent about his wife. The parents' power is what mattered. And his children's performance was what mattered. So too in the present day, oftentimes we think about families being about the parents. This is my family. Or even the children. My children have rights. Or we think about our families as being about performance. My son was in a race the other day and he won his race. Ryan, you don't know anything about that, but he won. And it was a big deal. It was a big deal in our family. You would have thought the earth had stood still. Eben, my son, won his race. And all too often in our family, that's what matters. The championships, right? The accolades, the career they're going to get, what city they live in, the acclaim it brings to our family. You know what our modern worldly family is like. It's about us and what we do. Yes? And Ephesians chapter 6 takes that and flips it. It completely remixes it and makes us realize that's not what the family is about. Just a reminder here, in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the whole section is bookended, as it were, by two references to the Lord. And this morning I want to work with you here very briefly through these 4 verses and just observe 3 ways in which Paul remixes the family in Ephesians chapter 6 and changes our perception of how it is that the family should live. The first instruction that upends our expectations here is in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Now, we're going to come back to this, but just notice that this is a call for children. I'm speaking to all of us, but especially to you younger people. It's a call for children to go deeper in the way that they think about their obedience to their parents. It's not simply to their parents, it's an obedience in the Lord. It's an obedience that's focused upon a relationship to God and to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're going to come back to that, but we shouldn't rush past the point that Paul here says that children should obey their parents, and that this is an important aspect of the obedience that they should show. Now, of course, you know, obedience is easy. Everybody knows that, until you're doing something you don't want to do. And Paul doesn't make a equivocation here. He doesn't say obey them what you want to do. He says obey them. And that's a basic command. We need to emphasize that, especially in a world in which so much pushes against children's obedience. We want to obey when it's what we want to do. My daughter wanted to go on a road trip 3 weeks ago. She said, Daddy, can I take the car? I said, yes, you can. She said, I will do anything to be able to go. Okay, I said, okay, you can go. She said, I'll call in. I'll let you know when I get there. I'll even weed eat the lawn for you. And she knew what buttons to push there. And I said, that's fine, honey. You can take the car on the road trip, except you need to pay for the gas for the road trip. She says, oh, never mind. She was willing to obey until she was asked to do something she didn't want to do. And isn't that the way it is? And Paul here says that the children should obey the Lord. In any case, he doesn't make an exception. By the way, she went on the road trip, and I think I ended up paying for the gas. But you fathers, you know how that goes. So Paul doesn't place restrictions on this obedience, and we need to emphasize that because so much in our world complicates children's obedience. The call for them to do what parents tell them to do. And I just want to take a sidebar here and say this is especially the case in our world in the past 30, 40 years because of technology. You know, there was a day when the hardest thing about obedience was cleaning your room. Remember that? But now it's gotten so much more difficult. There was a survey done by the think group Barna Group, and they did a survey, and they asked parents about parenting, and the Barna survey said that 78% of parents said that it's more complicated to be a parent now than when they were a child. Can I get an amen? But the reason they said that was because of technology. The top reason they said is because we live in this technological age. And as a parent and grandparent, you can understand just how difficult it is to compel obedience in a world of smartphones and social medias and of screens all around us. It's become much more difficult to regulate those things, and as a child, to be regulated. And Paul says, though, that in all these things, children are to obey their parents. And he doesn't mention smartphones or TikTok, but that's certainly in view in these verses. That is something that children should obey. But beyond that, there's this attitude of honor in verse 2. You read it there in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2. And practically speaking, what does that mean? Honoring our parents means respecting them, showing seriousness towards them, respecting them both in our thoughts and in our deeds. You could think of different ways in which we should show respect and honor to our parents. When we speak well of our parents, we do that. When we esteem them, both publicly and privately, we honor our parents. When we forgive our parents, we honor them. When we seek their wisdom, we honor them. And when we care for them, especially as they get older in life, we honor them. These are all things that Paul says, children, honor your parents. And this is what they're called to do. And we're not without a biblical model of this. Don't you know that Jesus himself, Jesus was the ultimate model of honor. You remember what the scriptures say over there in Luke chapter 2, verse 51. In Luke chapter 2, verse 51, it describes Jesus who, when he went home, he was someone who came to his parents and were, it says, submissive to them. Submissive to his parents. And he lives his life like this because we know that in his final hours before his death on the cross, we read in John chapter 19, verse 21, that he ensured provision for his mother, not only having obeyed her in his life, but honoring her in his death. You remember the passage in John chapter 19, verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Jesus shows us how we should obey and honor our parents. And Paul says, do that. But here's the real revolution. And it comes in this passage in chapter 6, verse 1, when he says that we should honor and obey our parents in a deeper way. He says, because it is in the Lord. This is action done both with reverence towards God and loyalty towards Jesus. I obey my parents because I obey the Lord. Now, this is different. I just want to emphasize, this is different than what you would read if you went back to the ancient world and read Greco-Roman household codes that told parents and children how to behave. Because in the ancient world, the parents were the gods. They were the masters. And it wasn't through an appeal to a deity. It was just you did what your parents said. And so, too, today, in our workaday world, in this contemporary world of 2023, how did that happen? In 2023, oftentimes in our families, and maybe this is the case in yours, it's a two-dimensional tug of war between parents and children. Do what I say. No, I won't. And what's missing is this phrase, in the Lord. Paul says what we need to see is the relationship between a child and a parent is three-dimensional. That within that there is an obedience to God. Parents should be honored and obeyed because of God, of Christ in God. And so parents are given obedience because of the gospel. And you know how important this is, what we're talking about here. This is so key in our lives as families, that third dimension of the Lord be in the parent-child relationship. Because when it's not, and when that child moves away from that parent, if that child's obedience has not been in the Lord, then that child moves away from the faith of his or her parent. It is so vital that third dimension be there. They won't honor the faith of their parents because they'll move away from the parent. Many of you know my good friend Phil Robertson. He was an evangelist down in Gainesville, and he was there at the Glen Springs Church of Christ there, right next to the University of Florida. I'm not a Gators fan, but I'll mention him. And he oftentimes describes the situation that he would find himself in as an elder and an evangelist there. Young people would come to the University of Florida, go there for 4 years, and they'd place membership in the church, and the parents would be there for the first few days, and the child would attend there for the first few days, and then suddenly the child stopped showing up. And then that college-age freshman, sophomore, junior would come to worship services when the parent showed up in town. But other than that, the congregation, the evangelists, the elders wouldn't see them. This is a familiar story to you, I can tell. And what Phil would describe is that the attrition rate there in the Glen Springs Church was about 50%. The idea is among those freshmen that came in as Christians with their parents that first day, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, only about 50% would make it until senior year as faithful Christians in a local congregation. That's shocking. And this is what happens when the Lord is not part of that parent-child relationship, because when the parent moves away, the faith moves away. And lest we be too hard on the Glen Springs congregation, surveys tell us that this is the national norm. Another Barna study recently done tells us that, broadly speaking, generally broad brush here description, 7 out of 10 Christians move away from their faith or the church within the first 2 years of leaving their families, their parents. And the number one reason for that, says the study, which surveys these young people, is because they have gone off to college or they have moved out of their parents' home to take a job. And so you see this displacement from the parent displaces their faith because the faith never was really their own. And so here in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul starts off with this revolutionary idea, which we've got to see, or we won't see how it reframes our universe, is that when the parent requests, demands obedience from that child, it's not because of the parent, it's because of the Lord. And from the very outset, that must be at the heart of that, or that relationship to the Lord will last 18, 19, 20, for some of you 23, 24 years. And once they're gone, so goes the faith. And Paul knows this. Paul knows that the children need motivation. And so that's one reason here in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 through 3, he gives even more motivation for the child to understand that the Lord cares about their obedience. You notice there in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 through 3, he reaches back to this oft-forgotten commandment The fifth commandment, quoting there from Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, this promise to the people of Israel that God will give them a good life, whether in this life or the life to come, if they're obedient to their parent. And we know the truth of this. We have a saying, you've probably heard this, we have it in my family, that the saying goes, if you don't want no drama, you better honor your mama. Right? And that's just a silly saying which speaks the truth that if we want to have a good life, we better honor our parents. And whether in this life or in the life to come, we are promised that if we live our life with our parents with a view to God's judgment and God's kingdom, then we'll enjoy the blessings of home, and a heavenly home even. And so here's the question, and this comes to our second point. What can parents do to develop this sort of relationship to the Lord and their relationship to their children? What to do? We understand that this emphasis upon the Lord, that there needs to be an attention to obedience to God, first of all, that our direction needs to be upward, not to me. What can we do? And so Paul, in the remainder of these verses, describes what parents do, first in the negative sense and then in the positive sense. And all of this is about maintaining this godly family. He goes on to say in verse 3 that parents need to be focused upon the child's heart. Not upon their accolades, not upon the championship or the career or what city they work in or how their lives affect my family's reputation, but rather upon their heart. Paul goes inward, and he doesn't use the word heart. What he tells fathers here, as the head of the household is fathers, when you live with your children, you be attentive to their heart, to their emotions, to their motivation. He says there in chapter 6, verse 4, he says, Father, don't provoke your children to wrath or to anger. You can see the interior focus here. He's focused upon who they are inside. This is paralleled by a passage in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, where Paul says, Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Fathers, don't anger your children. Don't discourage your children. And Paul here is reshuffling the deck. He's remixing how we think about families, because if there's anything I know as a parent, it's that I care about the actions of my child. Are they obeying me? Are they doing what I tell them to do? And Paul says, nope. Father, you, especially you, who are more prone to anger and to harshness, you be less concerned about what they're doing and their action, and more concerned about what they're feeling, what their motivation is. You get to the heart of the matter. You don't dispirit them. Don't discourage them. You see how that changes everything? That, in my world, that flips everything. Because no longer am I focused upon what their physical actions are or what their material accolades are. It now goes inward. And Paul says, you need to be focused upon how your children are thinking and acting. And so this isn't a surprise. I think of Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, where it says, a harsh word stirs up anger. Paul says, don't be harsh. He wants them to cause children to love the Lord. And we could think of a variety of ways in which a father could stir up anger and discouragement in a child. But I just want to leave you with this one for this morning. I think one thing that Paul is talking about here is that when fathers, and by extension fathers and mothers, engage their children in the family, they need to convey that family, that space in which a father and his children are living, is a safe place. It's a place where wrath and anger doesn't reign. And there's a variety of ways in which that can happen. It's a place where discouragement and disparagement doesn't reign. It's a place where one has safety. One has safety. It's a place in which one can have room to acknowledge doubts and to acknowledge sins and questions. And Paul says, Father, when you engage your children, you don't make them angry. You don't discourage them. Rather, you be training them in a place of safety, a place where one can be a child and make a mistake and experience the mercy of the gospel and not just the wrath of the Father. There's a different view here of fatherhood, and you see this throughout the New Testament. Jesus showed this. I love the passage in Luke 22. You remember there in Luke chapter 22, verse 31 and 32, where Jesus knows that Peter is going to foul it up. Remember this? And rather than getting angry at him and says, "Oh, Peter, stop it," he says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has demanded you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you," says Jesus, "that your faith may not fail, and that when you've turned, you might strengthen your brothers." That's the sort of fatherhood which we're called to have and which Jesus shows there. He doesn't explode at Simon's failure, but rather he shows a place for repentance and for return, and was mentioned this morning in the sermon. Peter does exactly that. Because Jesus knows that, as James says, we all stumble in many ways. Everyone has sinned. And so, fathers, as we engage the children, Paul says, look, don't engage them with wrath. Rather, be a place where they have space to speak their doubts, to acknowledge their sins and their failures, and to learn by asking. This is so very vital. The reason that these children will grow in their faith is it's a place where they can experience failure and know that they can acknowledge it. You know, I found in my life and in my teaching and the places I've been that the safest place is where you can have the most risky and dangerous conversations and know that anger and discouragement won't result. Right? You can be honest. And that's the sort of fatherhood, the sort of parenthood that Paul is calling us to. There was a survey done by another school called Fuller Seminary out in California, and they asked students, they said, young people, they said, why is it that you fall away from the faith? And that was answered. But the other question is why did you stay with the Christian faith? Why did you continue in church? And the top reason that young people stay or leave the church or remain steadfast in their faith is whether or not they have a safe haven to express their doubts and their concerns regarding their faith, both before they leave home and after they leave home. And the survey observed that they find this refuge in one of three places: in the home, in the school, and in the church. And if they don't have that safe haven to acknowledge their doubts and concerns, they're much more likely to leave the faith, because they only get anger and discouragement when they acknowledge it. And so you see the revolutionary transformative idea here of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Do you see it? And that is that fathers provide this sort of safe space in order to encourage a heart of faith, a relationship to the Lord in their children. They're focused upon the motivation, the heart, the why of the child's faith, and not just what they're doing and the external action. I'm looking at a room full of parents and grandparents who get this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I'm just emphasizing here that the question is not what they're doing, but why they're doing it. And Paul emphasizes that here. And it comes through in such subtle ways. Now, let me give you one example to take home with you. Oftentimes, a father's most powerful impact, and this is true of mothers as too, I know, is on how they receive questions. Are questions from our children about our convictions and our decisions, or are they about the consciences and the judgments of the children who are asking them? And oftentimes they come in such bewildering and mind-numbing ways. Here are 4 from my past year with my 4 daughters and son. Dad, is Jesus the Son of God or God? Right? Dad, where are the dinosaurs in the Bible? That's a good one. How do you respond to those things? Dad, this gets close to home. Dad, why do you go past the speed limit? Right? These are ones that are that hit us, and how we respond affects them and their obedience in the Lord. Most recently, I got this question: Dad, why can't I wear these shorts? And so how we respond, whether with discouragement or anger, because I said so, or an explanation of the principles and the faith that's involved in that, makes all the difference. And that's what I'm trying to convey to you. We talk about the Copernican revolution in the family. It's a matter of their relationship to the Lord and the question of their heart's motivation, and not necessarily just what they're doing in their life. Parents, train the heart. Finally this morning, Paul completes this revolution here in the final verse, 6 verse 4. And he says, parents, bring your children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, in the instruction and the training of the Lord. And I just want to observe three things here, and we'll conclude. In this verse, the word for instruction or admonition in the King James literally means to put something in someone's mind. And so parents are training, and fathers and mothers focusing not only on the action, but on what's in the child's mind. Their knowledge and their mindset. That's what's key here. And so the focus is on changing how children think about what they do, and not only what they do. You see the revolution on this. It's a matter of looking inward, even in that training and that putting things in the mind. And so he says, bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And the idea here is that parents represent the Lord to their children. The idea is that when they see me, not only in what I say, but in how I say it and what I do, I am the image of God for them. I am the representative of God's training and teaching for them. And so as parents, we're focused not on myself and my priorities and even what my child is due. Notice here, even in the training, my focus is on heaven, representing the Lord to my children, and also putting things into their hearts and minds that will make all the difference. And so in all this, we show the Lord's discipline and instruction. That makes all the difference. Let me just observe this one thing. Throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament, one thing that's emphasized again and again about the Lord's discipline, His love, His mercy, is that it is consistent. That's an attribute. The faithfulness, the steadfastness of God runs throughout all of the Scripture. And I would just leave this with you, parents and children, that as we bring our children up in the nurture and admiration of the Lord, of the training and the instruction of the Lord, that we show forth the consistency and steadfastness of God in what we do. A wise man once told me in Texas, he says, John, you need to be the sun, like the sun in the sky. You need to be the sun rising for your son every day, giving him warmth, giving him light, like the rhythms of life. Not checking out, not skipping a day, because I am showing forth God to my child, both sons and daughters. And Paul here says, children, obey in the Lord. Fathers, pay attention to the heart. And parents and fathers, you show forth the Lord in your instruction to your children. That remixes things. It changes things when we realize what all of this is about. So Ephesians chapter 6, a revolutionary remix. Like that? See what I did there? It's powerful because it teaches us that we need to recenter our homes. Remember Copernicus? The center of the solar system is not the earth, it's the sun. The center of our families is not we and our children and the things that we can see. The center of our families is the Lord in our hearts. And Ephesians chapter 6 brings that home to us, encouraging us to obey Him from the heart. May God bless our families. May God bless these words as we listen to them and live them out in our lives. If you're not obedient to the Father, what He tells you is that He has a Son that you should obey Him. Accept Him as your Lord. Be allegiant to Him and begin that life of loyalty and love by putting Him on in baptism this very morning. We stand ready to assist while we stand and while we sing.
There is beyond the edge